Thank y'all for being here this morning. We're right at 10 o'clock, just a minute or two after. And so I do want to thank each one of you. I know y'all are busy and a lot of other places you could be today, but this was important. It's something that we need to do. And so I want to call this meeting to order. And I want to call on Mr. Ted Booth. He's call our roll.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Beckett.
Here.
Mr. Blackman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Eubanks. Mr. Ford. Mr. Mangold. Mr. Reed. Mr. Shanks. Mr. Taylor. Mr. White. And from the Senate, Mr. Kirby. Mr. Bryan. Mr. DeBar. Mr. Harkins. Mr. Hobson. Mr. Parker. Mr. Simmons. Mr. Tate. Ms. Turner Ford. Mr. Wiggins. Quorum is present.
All right, thank you. Thank you for calling that. We do have a quorum. I have been asked to remind you to speak into the microphone and be sure and turn it on if you have something to say, because we're Zooming the meeting. And so for the benefit of those who aren't in the room, we'd ask you to do that. The next order of business is the approval of June 30, 2021 minutes. I think there are a couple of corrections to those minutes, and I would ask Mr. Booth to go over that.
Sure. When we mailed out your packet, a couple of names were omitted from the list of members present. We've been notified of that. So the minutes before you have the corrections that were made.
All right. I think everyone has had an opportunity to look over those minutes. I do need a motion that we approve those minutes. All right. Do I have a second? Is there any discussion that anyone would have? All right. Well, all those in favor say aye. Any opposed, say aye. All right. Motion's approved. The next thing is the approval of the redistricting criteria. And I would ask our attorney, Mr. Tommy Carden, if he will briefly explain the criteria for the legislative and the congressional redistricting. Excuse me, I'd like to refer you to the last page of your packet, and that if you need to follow along. And yes, if you would do that.
My goodness, Mr. Chairman, I have to get official and get behind the microphone then, huh? I thought I was going to be able to walk around a little bit. Mr. Chair, may it please the chairman and members of the committee, particularly Senator Bryan. I wanted to just go over in general terms with you the criteria that are before you. The purpose and reason that you adopt criteria is to provide yourselves with a roadmap, so to speak, in terms of how you plan to draw districts, so that there are some criteria that you have to go by and that you can follow throughout the process. The criteria that we're presenting to you is criteria that this committee has previously used essentially during the last two cycles of redistricting since 2000. There are just some slight changes that have been made, and it involves particularly congressional districts, because this will be the first time that we actually may have a congressional plan adopted by this committee as opposed to the federal courts drawing it. So let's start with the congressional criteria, even though that's the second group on your list, but let's just start with those, and I'll go over those briefly. As I've said, the federal courts in Mississippi have drawn congressional districts for the past two cycles. During this cycle, this would be an opportunity for this committee to recommend a plan and for the legislature as a whole to adopt a plan. Along those lines, the criteria that you see before you, the first criteria deals with the population of each congressional district. And the courts have instructed us that the population for congressional districts need to be as equal as nearly as practicable. What that means is they've almost got to be identical. They got to be as close to identical as you possibly can get them, given the other legal issues that you have to deal with. So that's the first criteria. Secondly, the districts need to be contiguous. Third, the districts need to comply with all state and federal laws, and particularly Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act as amended, and of course, the state and federal constitutions. And then we also have added a criteria that the committee should consider the neutral redistricting factors that the court has considered during the last 2 rounds of drawing the congressional plans. We think it's advisable for the committee to pay attention to what the court did and what the court used. And so we've incorporated that into your criteria. Those will be the criteria for the congressional districts. Going up to the criteria for the state legislative districts for the House and Senate seats, they're essentially the same as the congressional districts, except for 2 exceptions. The first is, with regard to the population, you have more leeway in drawing state legislative seats with your population numbers. You can be within plus or minus 5% of the ideal size of a district in drawing your legislative seats, as opposed to the congressional districts. They almost have to be equal. You don't have to get specific equality when it comes to House seats, but you've got a range that you can operate plus or minus 5%. Contiguity, and then the plan shall apply with all applicable state and federal laws, including Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And we don't have the criteria of the neutral principles that the court followed in the congressional districts because the court didn't address legislative districts. You have adopted those, and they have been pre-cleared and have not been challenged by a court or by someone in a court. So we don't have that criteria for you to follow. That's kind of a summary of both of those categories. I'll be happy to entertain any questions any of you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Carden. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? Go ahead. All right. Recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tommy, what in summary are the neutral redistricting factors the court considered in the Smith v. Hoseman case?
Compactness, county and municipality splits, the historical regional interests that are represented by the districts, the location of universities and military bases, the growth areas, trying to keep the growth areas, the areas that grew the most in separate districts, incumbency, and distances of travel in terms of, the span of the district.
Anything else? Any other questions? All right, I don't see any other questions from committee members.
Thank you,
for
Mr.
your
Chairman.
presentation. At this time, I would entertain a motion, second, for approval of the legislative criteria as laid out by Mr. Carden. All right, second. All right, I have a motion, second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, thank you for approval of the legislative criteria. I've asked for a motion, and second, for the approval of congressional criteria as laid out by Mr. Carden. All right, so motion. All right, second. All right, thank you. All right, all those in favor of approval of the congressional criteria, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, thank you for the approval of the congressional criteria. It's been approved. At this point, I want to remind members that in the very near future, there will be a meeting on the congressional plan. Some will, so we just, we understand that there's a time period that they have to qualify at the very beginning of the year. And we want to have a plan out early so the public will see the plan and those involved will see that. So I would imagine that we will be reconvening in early December. We don't have a set time. There's not a time for that, but just as reminders, then we'll try to make that at a consider everybody's schedules and try to pick a time when we can do that. I don't see any other business that we need to attend to today. Is there anything else there? You know of anything else? All right, at this time, I would make a motion, we adjourn.